As with the previous video, there is a lot of talking points to be made. I'm watching coverage of the US unrest on CNN. Now, about the term unrest, I think that's an appropriate term because there is riot, there is looting, there is disorder and anarchy, but there is also peaceful protests. So I think unrest is an appropriate generic term. Um, Van Jones on CNN has just made an interesting point about the culture wars, and he pointed out that people he knows on the right were shocked by the killing of George Floyd. In fact, there was actually universal outrage at that. This is something that maybe has been understated. Um, Often with police killings, you get a sort of divide where the right tend to defend the police and the left tend to denounce it. But with this one, very, very, very few people, if any, have defended what happened. But what Van Jones has said is that the initial response of people on the right was to be shocked by what happened. But then, as the peaceful protests turned to violence, whether that be people intercepting it or what, attitudes hardened, and people on the right actually wanted Trump to take a more assertive stance. People on the left were mocking him for hiding. Bizarre scene today. He appeared outside a church in Washington D.C. holding a Bible. And even in the narcissistic world of Donald Trump, when he praised himself in brackets saying, "Well done, Donald Trump," I mean, no words. I just can't think of words to describe that. It's pure Trump land. Um, it's worth pointing out, politically speaking, there is some echoes with this in the early 1990s, insofar as in the early 90s there was a recession, not as bad as this one, but there was a recession. And there was racial tensions with the Los Angeles riots. George H.W. Bush had high approval ratings with the first Gulf War, but those two events seriously dented his approval ratings. And he was nowhere near as polarizing a figure as Donald Trump is. So I think that there is a strong possibility that Trump will be the first one term president since George H.W. Bush. But um, there's a lot of things going on with this. I mentioned that the protests had spread to London, to Copenhagen, to Berlin. They've also spread to Paris and elsewhere. It's pretty much dominated the internet today. I mean, pretty much every notification I've seen on my Facebook news feed has been people posting about this. Um, I've seen Thai Republicans post memes about George Floyd, so it's really spread around the world. Um, Now, in one sense, this is understandable. It's an important event, and I think it's more than George Floyd. It's also about the case of the black woman who died in Kentucky and other African Americans who have died. There is unquestionably racial politics at work here, and unquestionably the culture wars are a big part of this. Trump threat to send in the military, is it necessary? Well, the situation's certainly very serious. I know in New York there's now a big rift between the governor, Andrew Cuomo, and the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio. Cuomo publicly criticized the mayor. I know for a leading Democrat to criticize another leading Democrat in that way demonstrates that it is clear there's strong feelings there. Um, the situation in America's major cities is just shocking. I mean, and this is what's interesting is African American mayors have not shied away from vocally condemning the violence. Lori Lightfoot, the new mayor of Chicago, was very clear that she was criticizing the vandalizing of small businesses and so on. My position is there's no amount of anger, there's no amount of excuses that can be made for that sort of wanton criminality. And because the culture wars are as they are, um, people will be okay with a left wing politician saying that's thuggery, but if Trump says it, then that's Trump being a demagogue. I think Trump is a demagogue, but he's not wrong to say that people vandalizing businesses is fuggery. Um, the problem is Donald Trump is also playing in the caricature of his critics, and he hasn't said anywhere near enough to condemn police brutality. But to be fair to the police, there are differences force to force, and there have been a number of senior officers making conscious efforts to reach out. The police chief of Denver, for example, was marching arm in arm with protesters, peaceful protesters. NYPD officers were making gestures, and there was other officers in Minnesota who were saying that Derek Chauvin doesn't represent them. They were even kneeling. So it's very, very important that police officers are not collectively vilified. I think that's very important because if they're collectively vilified, then people think they're all racist killers, and they're not. And I also think that they're in a very difficult job. I mean, if you have a police vehicle, for example, people have been showing this footage of a police vehicle in New York City driving with protesters in front of it. Now, my thinking with that is, firstly, last night in New York City, a police officer was deliberately driven over. But in terms of that incident, if you're in a vehicle and it's being surrounded by violent protesters, you could be seriously fearing that they could drag you out of your vehicle and beat you up. That indeed happened to some protesters. Excuse me, to some, no, not to some protesters. My mistake, not protesters. It happened to this young black couple in Atlanta. They were dragged from the car. I don't mean romantic couple, I think they were friends, totally innocent. And there was heavy criticism of those officers. So there is a real, but what I was going to say was the incident in New York City. If there's officers in a vehicle and they're being surrounded by aggressive rioters, they could be fearing that they're going to get lynched. It's not inconceivable. This is the scene from Houston right now. I'll just show you from the CNN footage. This is, of course, George Floyd's hometown. Hope that was clear on the screen. I don't know how clear it turns up, but um, here's the problem. You have so many different people involved in this. There's good cops and there's bad cops. There's peaceful protesters, there's rioters, there's left, there's right. Um, and honestly, it just seems like a situation that is out of control. There just seems to be, it just seems to be out of control. And I don't want to be overly negative. There has been good gestures. I saw one interesting video where a representative from Black Lives Matter spoke at a Trump rally, and he got jeered, but he also got applauded for some of the things he had to say. Um, so you get situations like that, but as encouraging as that is, I still think the culture war over there is so deeply entrenched that it will take a lot more. I think it will take some institutional changes. There's curfews tonight in Philadelphia, in New York City, nationwide. Uh, Already people have violated those curfews. Now, how the police respond, if people violate the curfews but they're not being violent, maybe the police should not necessarily turn a blind eye, but maybe take a cautious approach. If they're violating the curfew to loot, to vandalise, then the police need to take a tough approach. And here's the thing: if they're being, it's like a cycle. People are angry about police brutality, but then there's clearly some rioters who are taunting the police. Then, if the police respond with force, it just reiterates, "Oh well, look, they're being violent." And here's the narcissist thief holding his Bible. It's just incredible. It's surreal seeing all of this because I don't think there's been anything like this since 1968. There hasn't, in fact. But in terms of also who's causing the trouble, that's another point of contention because it's been speculated that outsiders are stirring things up. I know the governor of Minnesota speculated on that, but others have said that isn't the case. And apparently, according to CNN, 80% of bookings in Minneapolis were locals. Um, Nevertheless, there has been outsiders involved, and some of them have defended their actions. There was a representative of the so-called Boogaloo Boys, which has been described as far right, and I described it as such because that's what I'd read. But this guy claimed he was a left anarchist, so I don't think they really know what they are, because they associate themselves with right-wing militias, or at least with that whole Second Amendment thing, which is certainly associated with the political right. But then you get Antifa. Now, I'm not going to say anything nice about Antifa. I think they are fucked. And the guy who wrote the so-called Antifa manual, Mark Bray, has claimed the sort of things that have been going on are not criteria of Antifa. They don't fit the description. Well, he would say that. This is one of the founders of Antifa. Of course, they're going to put out positive PR for their image. I wouldn't believe a word he says. Um, the way I see it is, if you're covering your face, I'm not talking about face mask because that's now the standard because of the virus. But if you're covered from head to foot in black, with a black balaclava, and you've got a Molotov cocktail in your hand, or you're spray painting a wall or something, you're going to get a negative reputation. This is the scene right now in New York City. It may have actually been from about an hour ago, but that's the situation. So who knows where all of this will lead? I do think if Trump turns in the military, I think that's premature. It's a serious situation, but I don't think it's. I think that would definitely escalate things. I think that would inflame anger, um, and I don't think there's a need for it at this point. But if there's more deaths, if the rioting and violence continues, there'll be no choice but for the authorities to take a harder line. Certainly with the rioters. Um, and I think groups like Black Lives Matter. I mean, what I find really interesting is celebrities are latching onto this, including here in the UK. Holly Willoughby, Rihanna in the United States, they've been doing this thing apparently where they've been blacking out their Twitter feeds as a sort of demonstration of protest. What I find a bit galling is celebrities. Some of them, I believe, really do have strong feelings and have conviction. Frankly, I think a lot of them latch on to be woke. Now, why is there not the same level of anger in Western societies against the Chinese state? People might say this is whataboutery, but we've had protests outside the American embassy. Where's the protests outside the Chinese embassy for the endemic persecution of Uyghurs? The issues about racism. What about Han racism against Uyghurs? Because that's a central issue of what's going on there. Um, I just think there's a lot of hypocrisy because the sort of people who are virtue signaling right now, a lot of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but a lot of them would be the first to say, "Oh, if you criticize the Chinese government, that's Chinese racism, anti-Chinese racism." This seems very hypocritical. I don't know. It's just a very tense situation, and my concern is severalfold. Firstly, the lack of leadership from the top. Trump's been a disaster. I think Biden has shown leadership. He's got a good balance with this. Um, but if Biden loses the election, then what's the next 4 years going to be like? 4+ years. What if this spreads to London? It's possible. And this is a total disaster in terms of PR for Western democracy because totalitarian states that have no right to, because they've got no ground to, you could be absolutely sure that Chinese state media will be plastering this all over Weibo and all over social media to try and say, oh, look, this is how awful and racist and disorderly America is, even though they censor their own problems. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. I'm sure there'll be more to say in time, but it seems to be a really tense situation, and I just hope it calms down in the next week. Well, sooner than that, obviously, but just looking at scenes from Washington, D.C., a lot of trouble there. Yeah. If you're in the States, particularly in one of the bigger cities, let me know what the situation is. Thanks for watching.